Several years ago, we had a couple of members that actually were pretty good friends while they were at church. The problem was they worked in the same office in a government agency that shall not be named. And the problem was one of those members was kind of known for telling off-color, slightly racist jokes in the office. Slightly racist, that's kind of like being slightly pregnant. You can hide it for a while, but pretty soon it comes out and everybody knows it. But he would tell these jokes, but he would also say that he goes to church with so-and-so. Until finally one day, people are standing around, and he goes into his routine. She blows up and says, "You're either going to have to stop telling those jokes or stop telling people that we go to the same church." Well, think about that. Why would somebody that actually was fairly active, he would lead prayers, he would read scriptures, even occasionally do the table talk, and seemed to really believe the things that he talked about when he was at work, but have a totally different persona at church, but have a totally different persona when he was at work? Well, more than likely, the reason for that is he slipped into kind of an exaggerated way into what a lot of us do in compartmentalizing our lives so that we have one different persona when we're in one place and around one group of people, but slightly different when we're in someplace else. He probably did believe all the things that he's saying and all the things that he said while he was here. He just didn't make a connection to what that meant and what that should have meant for him when he was in a different place around different people. Now, several weeks ago, we started a series that we called Every Square Inch, where we were looking at how God is sovereign over all of our lives and how that particularly applies to our lives when we're at work. That we are not to have a totally different life and totally different personality around one group of people, but rather God reigns over our lives even when we're at work. And then if we're seen properly, our work lives is an opportunity that God gives us to be His men and His women and influence other people around us. We use this quote from Abraham Kuyper. He said, "There is not one square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, 'Mine.'" That Christ proclaims His ownership of every phase of our life. And if we see one phase as sort of being outside of His purview, then we need to look at that totally different. And then a very similar quote by C.S. Lewis: "There is no neutral ground in the universe. Every square inch, every split second is claimed by God, including the times we're at work, and counterclaimed by Satan." Now, because we interrupted this series for a couple of weeks, I thought we needed to go back and kind of remind ourselves of what we've already covered. Quick review then. The first lesson, we talked about how God invented work. It was God's idea that humans have a task. Even when He created this perfect world without weeds and without mosquitoes. Well, they probably had mosquitoes, they just didn't bite anybody. He gave Adam and Eve something they were to do in the Garden of Eden. They were to dress and to keep it. In fact, the word that is used for dressing the garden and working in some translations is the word that's the root behind the word slave later on in other New Testament passages. So Adam and Eve were expected to slave. Now, after they sinned, that became a harder task. Now the ground fought back, and Adam had to fight the weeds and the thorns and the thistles for every mouthful of food he could produce from the earth. But still, it was God's idea that we work, and therefore He is sovereign over our work. In the second lesson, we looked at several texts from the New Testament that looked at slaves and masters. There's several texts in Ephesians and Colossians and 1 Timothy and some others that usually go by the name the household codes, where we're given instructions how we live in households, and there's instructions to slaves and masters. And in those texts, slaves are taught that they are to obey their masters, and even to the point of working for the master as if they were working for the Lord. And in that way, they make the teaching about Christ, the gospel message itself, attractive to unbelievers. If the gospel works. If the Christian life works, then it's got to work at work, right? And so Christian slaves, even in difficult circumstances, one point Peter tells those slaves, if you're serving a pagan master who abuses you, well, that's what you were called to do. Christ left you an example. He suffered for you, and so sometimes we even have to suffer for him. But the larger application is simply at work, the way that we conduct ourselves before our bosses or supervisors and coworkers says something about how much we believe about Christ and how that works in real life. So today we're going to simply look at two different verses and notice how it sort of goes along with those two in maybe more of a practical way. The first of those texts is 1 Peter 3 and verse 13. This little mini paragraph begins like this. Who is going to harm you if you are eager to do good? It's probably a hypothetical question, right? Who is going to harm? Generally speaking, it's right to do the right thing. And generally speaking, people appreciate you when you do the right thing. Although Peter is writing to a church on the cusp of persecution. The forces are already beginning to marshal themselves. There's going to become a full-blown state-sponsored persecution during the time of Nero Caesar, a persecution that is going to cost Peter as well as Paul their lives. And so you need to understand that you need to do good even if you're harmed. So he goes on to say, but even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear their threats. Do not be frightened. So he doesn't tell them they should not expect pushback from the world. What he tells them is they should not be afraid when that pushback comes. Even if you are called to suffer, and many of the people that Peter is writing to are indeed going to suffer because they insist on doing what's right, and Peter's advice to them is don't fear that. Remember what Jesus said about don't fear the one who can kill the body, rather fear the one who can destroy both body and soul in hell. So we need to understand who it is that is in charge of the universe, and we need to do what's right as he commands us to do. So Peter goes on to say in the first part of verse 15, but in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. In your hearts, some translations sanctify Christ. Other translations worship Christ as Lord. All of them indicate the very first step in understanding who we are in difficult situations is to understand who is the Lord. That Jesus is Lord, and therefore we should not fear. Now, sometimes, everybody likes to be liked, right? Now, some of us go to a great deal of trouble, more trouble than we should, and to get everyone to like us. But everybody likes to be liked, and sometimes we feel the pressure, maybe Peter would say the fear, of not being accepted by those around us. And so we go into chameleon mode. The old saying is, it's the nail that sticks up. That's the one that gets pounded. And so we try to get low and fit in with the weeds around us so that we don't stand out. Otherwise, we might stand out and get hammered down. So Peter says the first thing you need to do, even in your situation where there's hammers, is you need to decide who is Lord. If you revere or sanctify or worship Christ as Lord, that should make what comes next a little bit easier. So the last part of verse 15, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. Always be prepared to give a reason. You see, if you are living out loud your Christian faith, now I don't mean, and we're going to see in a second, that doesn't mean obnoxious or a know-it-all kind of way, but if you're actively living your Christian life in front of others, people will take note. And there may come a time where they want to know why it is that you're different than everybody, and so therefore you need to be prepared to give that answer. Now, I don't know if you're like me, hopefully not, but sometimes you come up with exactly the right thing to say, approximately 24 hours after you should have said it. You have one of those moments, You know, that's why Peter says you need to always be prepared. Because, you know, in cartoons, they always have this little thought bubble that's coming up over their heads when, you know, somebody's thinking about something. We don't get that in real life. We don't ever know what it is that somebody's going to ask us the question. And so we've got to be prepared all the time. Not to have all the answers, but to give our answer for the reason, for the hope that we have. Now, he says, how you do that is just as important as what you say in doing that, right? So do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience. We are to be able to give the answer, not come across as somebody that has all the answers, right? We are to respond to people with gentleness and respect. We're going to see Paul making the very same point a little bit later in a totally different context. Because if we come across in the wrong way, that has a tendency to negate whatever answer it is that we give. That, you know, it may be that we're going to be persecuted, but Peter wants us to make sure that we're persecuted as a Christian, not because we're a jerk. Because sometimes Christians come across in a way that sort of labels them as being something of a jerk. A chapter later, Peter says this, if you suffer, it should not be, earlier it said if you suffer as a Christian, but if you suffer, you should not be as a murderer or a thief or any other kind of criminal or even as a meddler. Okay, so Peter doesn't exactly use the word jerk, but he comes about as close as you can in Greek, I guess. The word meddler, and it's translated different things in different translations, but it really means one who getteth in another's business, to use the King James terminology. Yeah, it's somebody that meddles in somebody else's business. So in other words, comes across as a jerk. We are to give an answer to people that asks us, and if we're rejected, if we're opposed, if there's pushback, make sure it's because of the answer you gave and not as you came across in giving the answer. Nobody likes somebody that knows everything about everything. And sometimes we come across just like that. So it's as important to be known by the gentleness of our answer as maybe the strangeness of the answer that we give, at least in the ears of the person asking it. Okay, that's what Peter says to a church on the cusp of persecution. Now, Paul is going to say something to the Colossian church, and it's kind of in a context where he's been asking them to pray for him that he might be ready with the right words as he's sharing the gospel across the world. And that reminds him to say this. So don't just pray that I have the right words. Be ready for you to have the right words as well. Be wise in the way you act toward outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. Okay? Where is the place where we're, as Christians, the most around outsiders? Well, we said in the first lesson that we're at work more than any other single context, more than any other single activity, including sleep. We work more than we sleep because we don't get enough sleep and we work too much. So isn't that the opportunity that we're going to have to be around outsiders? So Paul says, be wise in the way that you act. And when he says, make the most of every opportunity, that's very similar to what Peter says in be prepared to give an answer. You never know when you're going to have the opportunity, so you got to be ready for that opportunity all the time. He continues in verse 6, let your conversation always be full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. Paul, like Peter, understands we're going to be placed in situations, opportunities, where we'll be able to speak a word for Christ. But what he says is, you need to be careful in all of your conduct around outsiders, because you never know when the opportunity, and you want to be taken seriously. So all the time that you're around other people, don't give them the reason to sort of discount you as a witness, or else you might not have the chance to answer the question. The chances are pretty good that the brother in my original example who we talked about, who's telling all these off-color and racist jokes in the office, he's probably not going to be asked to give a reason for the hope. He's fitting in with everybody around him. He's not going to make the most of every opportunity because he's not going to have any. But we are to always let our speech be full of grace. If we're at the water cooler participating in all the office gossip, those words aren't full of grace. Make sure our words are seasoned with salt. If we're jumping into every debate about politics or sports, SEC versus Big Ten, those kinds of, if we're known for somebody that's always jumping into controversies, people are not going to listen when we get involved in a conversation about the one that matters the most. So be very careful how you conduct yourself so that you have an opportunity to give that answer. Every square inch of our lives belongs to God, even the part at work. Every situation we are put in, we are ambassadors of Christ, even when we're at work. Everywhere we are, we must be ready to speak a good word for Christ when given the opportunity, even at work. Now, I understand that most workplaces probably have some kind of policy against what would be called proselyting, recruiting people to your religious viewpoint. So probably setting up an evangelistic Bible study in the break room at lunch is probably out of the question for most of us. But being a good friend who has a conversation with another friend at work is probably not against anybody's policy. And you know what else is not against any workforce policy? Practicing love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, goodness, and self-control. But when we practice those things, maybe especially at work, because we all know there are jerks at work, right? I had in my notes to pause for an amen there. If we are practicing the fruit of the Spirit, that has a way to stand out. And then sometimes when there is a crisis that goes on, we might be the people that they talk to. Okay, in fact, there might even be ways that we can prime the pump to sort of set up conversations. These don't apply to everyone. I mean, you might not have the situation where you can have conversations like this, but probably most of us do, if not at work, then various places where we are. So just think about these as examples. Sometimes you're able to give casual church mentions without it being in your face evangelistic, right? You could say something like, hey, this guy at church, he got this really cool car. So we know you're not talking about me. And, the conversation is not about church, but you mention church, and that may put a peg down. Or, man, we had this really cool veterans potluck at church, and I didn't realize how many of our people at church were veterans in the military. You're talking about our military veterans there. You're not talking about church, but you're dropping a hint. Years ago, I mentioned this in a class not too long ago. Jeff Walling gave this example of how you can use world events sometimes. There's always something happening that's always the worst thing in the world that causes people to get really pessimistic. It might be a double whammy of hurricanes that hit the South that cause all that damage. It may be a terrorist attack. It may be, an election. But people are starting to say, man, I just don't know what's going on in the world. I just don't know what's going to happen. I worry about my kids. I worry about, and your response to that, try this next time it comes up. I would feel that way too, if it wasn't for one thing. They're always going to know what the one thing is. To which you reply, I believe God is in control of this world. I believe that God reigns. It may just lay there like a dead fish after you put it out there. But that may be the beginning of the next conversation. Maybe stress religious holidays. Maybe go a little bit out of the way to put a Christmas tree on your desk or to talk about Thanksgiving a little bit more than you normally would, or particularly at Easter time. And maybe your focus on the holidays will give opportunity to talk a little bit about the reason for the season, as we sometimes say. But it's a bridge between what's going on in life and maybe the beginnings of a conversation about faith. And you can even make casual Bible references, like you give somebody something and they say, "Oh, thank you so much." And you said, "Oh, well, as Jesus said, it's more blessed to give and to receive." Just casually throwing in something Bible there, to prime the pump again. Nothing may happen right then, but that may set up something in their minds that they're wondering about later that begins the beginning. And then maybe if the church is a little bit more aware, we can provide opportunities for you to invite somebody to come, to be there for that veterans potluck, or when we're having a picnic, or something else that may not be connected to what we do in our space like now, but it's something that we're together, where you invite them to that picnic, and then they're hanging around some church friends, and you never know where that's going to go. And then finally, if you're a person of prayer, and that may mean nothing more than when you're in the lunchroom, you bow your head and silently say a prayer. And then when people are talking to you about some loss in their family or some family crisis, just to mention, I'll be praying for you. And by all means, if you tell somebody you're going to pray for them, then pray for them. But sometimes when a crisis goes on, it's a person of prayer that people seek out. Okay, that's basically what we wanted to cover in this little short series on making sure that when we go to work each day, that God goes with us. Now, for some of us, it's easier than others, right? I mean, how many of you have had the thought, I'm up here talking about how you're to act at work, when basically I'm paid to talk about Christ at work. But all of us have that responsibility, right? The apostles were sent into all the world to preach the gospel to every creature. But the church grew because the people they talked to others about their faith. Michael Green, in his book on evangelism, said that the church grew in the first centuries because people, and I like his quote here, gossiped the gospel. They talked to people. They couldn't buy billboards, the church was persecuted, but they could whisper about their faith to their friends. And I think that's what we're called today. Now, we're getting ready to sing a song. And as we sing this song, if you're ready to begin your life of faith, if you recognize Jesus as Savior and you're ready to be baptized into Him, then our elders will be at the back and you can go and talk to them about that and they'll help you. Or if you have something you need to pray about, and again, our elders will be at the back. So as we sing this song, then just go to the back as we're singing. This song, The Days of Elijah, has an interesting line in it I want you to think about as we close. Still, we are the voice in the desert crying, prepare ye the way of the Lord. That's all of us, right? We're the voice in the desert crying. And sometimes that desert is where we work. Let us always remember that we are the ambassadors of Christ no matter where we are. Let's stand and sing together.